We'll be talking this chapter about gangs and how their existence affects delinquency. Gangs have existed in our country for centuries, and indeed have historically been a part of human society since at least ancient Greece, maybe even before, but the first evidence that we have is from ancient Greece. One of the more well-known gangs in American history was the Younger and James Gang. Youth gangs seem to have become more prolific in this country when industrialization occurred in the 1800s in the New England area, as certain areas moved from agrarian to industrial societies. Youth gangs began to flourish in Chicago and other large cities in the 19th century, as immigration and population shifts reached peak levels. At this time, they were primarily Irish, Jewish, and Italian. During the 20th century, the makeup of youth gangs changed rather significantly about every decade. Let's quickly define what a gang is before we start looking deeper into them. The U.S. Department of Justice defines a gang as 3 or more members whose members collectively identify themselves by adopting a group identity, which they use to create an atmosphere of fear or intimidation, frequently by employing one or more of the following: a common name, a slogan, identifying sign, symbol, tattoo, or other physical marking, style of color or clothing, hairstyle, hand sign, or graffiti. The purpose of the association is to commit criminal activity and violence, or intimidation is used to further the criminal objectives. That the members engage in acts that, if the youth gang members were adults, would be criminal activity, and with the intent to enhance or preserve the group's power, reputation, or economic resources. In the 1970s, gangs were responsible for a bigger proportion of muggings, robberies, extortions, and drug trafficking. During this time period, some gangs became sophisticated enough that law enforcement started regarding their activities as organized crime. By the mid-1980s, gangs started focusing even more on profit, and drug dealing became the predominant focus of economic opportunity for most gangs. Crack cocaine hit the streets, and distribution of the drug provided large profits for the gang. Several Los Angeles gangs established direct connections to major Colombian smugglers during that time. In major cities, heavily armed traffickers started openly selling on the street corners, using what were known as peewees, younger children, as police lookouts. In order to elude the police and maintain criminal connections, gangs have relied on technology. Pagers in the 1980s, cell phones in the 1990s, and the development of the internet has given gangs more opportunities to communicate privately and avoid police detection. Gangs exist in all types of communities. Since the early 1990s, nearly every city, many suburban areas, and even some more rural areas across the nation have experienced the reality of youths who consider themselves as gang members. In some areas, the urban gangs sent their members to outside communities to become part of their drug trafficking network and sell drugs in their communities. Other times, youth moved with their families to new communities and established a gang affiliate in the new community. So, in thinking about the different types of gangs that might exist, I want to talk just a little more about the historical perspective. There is some evidence that there were youth groups responsible for some degree of organized crime, even in ancient Greece. With that in mind, you can think about gang activity, to some extent, as being a function of needing to belong to a group, combined with the theory of opportunity structure, that there may be a lack of legitimate opportunities for young people, and that this in part leads to gang activity. As I said earlier, gangs existed in the United States out west, as in the Younger and James Gang, and also started to increase in New England in the 19th century as industrialization increased. As immigration increases, new immigrant groups tended to locate in the cities, and their youth might be involved in gang life there. And, of course, West Side Story. That's a great example of this kind of situation. What had changed a great deal in the past 3 or 4 decades is the lethality of violence, meaning that violence tends to be more deadly. This is due to the use of handguns and semi- or automatic weapons being used, instead of just knives or fists. During the 1960s, gangs and gang membership was on the decline. But at that time, there was a much lower illegal market and supply chain for drugs. But during the 1960s, the U.S. saw the first of their super gangs start to develop. The Crips, centered in Los Angeles, formed. By 1972, there were 18 Bloods and Crips gangs in Los Angeles, and over 500 known active gangs in just that city. In Chicago, the Vice Lords, the Blackstone Rangers, and the Gangsta's Disciples, all of which are super gangs today, got their start. During the 1960s, the Chicago super gangs were involved in political activism on a community basis, as well as crime. Some gangs were also involved in the civil rights struggle in the 1960s.